You're listening to This Week in America with Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody, coast to coast. This Week in America. Carlyle MacDuff is married to a Cuban citizen, and their home is in Cuba. His acute awareness of politics, having lived in several countries, and has British military and parliamentary experience. His late father held high office in the British Secret Intelligence Service, and his brother became a cabinet minister in Canada. Having the unusual experience of spending the majority of his time in Cuba as a member of a Cuban family, well aware from the popular tourist resorts, enables him to fully explain the realities of life for the average Cuban. His experiences lead him to conclude that although communism can endeavor to contain, it cannot quench the thirst for freedom that is a natural desire by mankind, including Cubans, demonstrated by so many risking their lives in their endeavors to flee. Carlyle MacDuff is the author of the highly praised Cuba, Lifting the Veil, and he's our guest on This Week in America. Carlyle, welcome to the program, sir. It's great to have you with us.
Well, it's nice to be talking to the States, Rick.
Well, yes, and Carlyle is up in Canada, where they just celebrated Canada Day the other day, and now we're down here in the U.S. getting ready for July 4th. Looking forward to the conversation and finding out sort of firsthand, behind the scenes, what actually is happening in Cuba. Why did you write the book, Cuba, Lifting the Veil?
Well, I know Cuba very well, as you've explained, but about 2013, the free outside world appeared to be thinking that some form of undefined change was taking place in Cuba, whereas in reality, nothing was changed with the Cubans. Cuba is a totalitarian state based upon Stalinist communism, and it's a criminal offense to criticize the communist regime, making it impossible for a Cuban to write such a book. And then because of censorship, and Cuba is one of the 10 most censored countries in the world, they would be unable to get it published, and they've insufficient resources. So I decided to try to reflect the reality of their lives under the communist dictatorship, and that's why I dedicated my book to the people of Cuba.
The book is Cuba, Lifting the Veil by Carlyle MacDuff, which is a pen name. Why did not use your real name?
Well, Rick, I have to protect not only myself, but more importantly, my wife and my Cuban family. The Castro regime, if able to identify me, would undoubtedly take measures to prevent me from obtaining a visa, or if I was in Cuba, in all probability, he would jail both my wife and I. Cubans are denied what is perhaps the most important right for those who, like your United States listeners, live in the free world. That is simply the right to openly disagree with others, and especially with political viewpoints.
Carlyle MacDuff, our guest on the program. The book is Cuba, Lifting the Veil. I mentioned in the introduction some of the background with Carlyle. The introduction of the book describes a very interesting background experience in the political world. What can you say about the late father and his occupation? Because it's just fascinating.
Well, within the confines of one who signed the British Official Secrets Act, which I have, I can reveal that he was a member of MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, worked during the Second World War in France with the resistance, followed by working in North Africa and Italy as a military lieutenant colonel as his cover. Then when Vienna fell to the Russians in May 1945, he was one of the first two Britons to arrive there, supposedly as deputy chief of the British military government, but actually becoming head of station for MI6. And subsequently, of course, he had agents in several Eastern European countries occupied by the USSR. And incidentally, they built a tunnel in Vienna called Operation Silver, which preceded the construction of the tunnel in Berlin, which was called Operation Gold. So our family had an apartment right in the center of quadripartite Vienna, which was within the Russian zone of Austria, in addition to our home in Britain. The American CIA was eventually formed in 1947, and I remember meeting my father's opposite number in the CIA in Vienna and his wife. Their first names, I'll give you the first names, were Herman and Ruth. I won't give you the second name. Then prior to Austria regaining its freedom in 1955, when the Russians retreated behind the Iron Curtain on the Hungarian border, my father spent a short time in Japan and Korea before going to Vietnam. We advised the U.S. about the methods used by the British and Commonwealth military under General Templer in the successful campaign against the communists in Malaya. where Britain fought a 10-year war. He then returned to Vienna, where he lived until his death until 1997.
It's such a fascinating life that you've had. I noticed some of the background, the British military, the parliamentary experience as well. Talk about that, because these were, I'm sure, interesting times for you.
Well, I was a commissioned officer in the Corps of Royal Military Police and served in Germany when we were still the occupying forces. As a military police officer, I had a warrant card giving me authority over all Allied military and all civilians. And I was there when Germany regained its sovereignty in July 1955. So that's my sort of military background, but I saw a lot of fairly bad things. Politically, although twice declining approaches to become a Conservative Member of Parliament and safe seats in the UK, I did accept an invitation to become a member of a British parliamentary committee. That's the equivalent of a congregational committee, and that is thought to be unique. But it gave me an opportunity to study politicians of differing political views, and as you know, in the UK, there's a wide spread of views,
yes.
sort of from Bernie Sanders across to the extreme right. But it gave me that opportunity to study those Westminster politicians.
With us on the program is Carlyle MacDuff, author of the book Cuba, Lifting the Veil, a fascinating look at Cuba. You got individual chapters in the book on Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, Che Guevara. Describe each of these, because we've heard about them, we've read about them, but totally from the outside. You've seen the impact all three of these have had on their countries. Talk about the Castro brothers and then Guevara.
Well, the Castro brothers were the sons of an immigrant farmer from Galicia in Spain, and his mistress, a domestic servant. Fidel was almost 6'4" in height in his prime, educated at private Jesuit boarding schools prior to studying law at Havana University. He had a wonderful physique, and in 1947 was the Cuban school's Athlete of the Year. But those physical abilities, coupled with his education, narcissistic nature, and vocal talents, and when I say that, for example, he still holds the record at the UN for the length of a speech at 4 hours, 29 minutes, made him a natural leader. Then, following the revolution, he had the opportunity, similar to those of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, to enter the history books as the liberator of his people. But instead, Fidel, in his thirst for power, chose communism and dictatorship. Both Castro brothers were attracted to having total power and control. And U.S. citizens should know that it's a matter of record that Fidel urged Nikita Khrushchev to make an initial nuclear strike upon the U.S. Khrushchev, in his wisdom, said no, because that would have started a Third World War. Fidel also had personally noteworthy charisma, was very attractive to women, having 12 children by 5 women, only one child, the first, known as Fidelito, and Fidelito, following his father's death, committed suicide, was conceived in wedlock. The other 11 were outside it. Although little brother Raul, and I say little brother because he was only 5'8", in his prime he's only about 5'7" now, lived in the shadow of his brother, he was and remains the power behind the Castro throne, which has now lasted 60 years. His relationship with the KGB started in 1953, 6 years before the revolution, when he visited the USSR and met Nikolai Leonov, a KGB colonel. Leonov, incidentally, was boss of Putin. Leonov joined them in Mexico and then in Havana to provide guidance. Raul is intelligent, ruthless, street smart, and humorless. On the 12th of January 1959, he executed 78 people in one day without trial at Santiago de Cuba, so he's a killer. His major achievement was establishing a thing called GAESA, G-A-E-S-A, a military holding company with 57 subsidiary companies, and between them control over 80% of the Cuban economy. The hotels, transportation companies, the shops, gas stations, the means of production, even including rum and cigars, are controlled by GAESA. As first secretary of the Communist Party, Raul still has precedence over Diaz-Canel, the new puppet president of the Council of Ministers. And he's also still head of the military, so he remains the dictator. When you go to Che Guevara, whose actual name was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna Lynch, his grandfather was Irish, Although by profession a medical doctor from Argentina, he shared with Fidel and Raul that lust for blood, power, and control, carrying out his first execution when they were still as revolutionaries hiding in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where, having shot his first victim, he opened the skull to examine the effects of his bullet upon the brain. The world has a false image of Che, a sort of latter-day Robin Hood type hero,
Yes.
with the famous T-shirt image worn by innocent admirers. But he's best described in a few of his own words. For example, youth has to learn to think as a mass. To think as an individual is criminal. And then, to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail. And another one, a revolution cannot be achieved with freedom of the press. Between January the 2nd and June the 12th, 1959, Che Guevara was responsible for the execution by firing squad of 357 Cubans at the La Habana fortress in Havana. So it's perhaps appropriate that he too was executed by the use of a gun. The archives document 3,615 executions by firing squad, with an additional 1,253 extrajudicial killings by the Castro regime. So that's the reality of their freedom.
Boy, you are lifting the veil. The name of the book by our guest, Carlyle MacDuff, Cuba, Lifting the Veil, a fascinating read. Tell me a little bit about the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. Give me some information on that.
The CDR is an internal security service, in other words, spying,
Yes.
based upon the infamous East German Stasi, who actually assisted in its formation and training. There's at present the CDR on every block of every village, town, and city in Cuba. They have to report at least once a year to their boss, Alexandro Castro Espin, son of Raul Castro, at the Ministry of Interior. Alexandro also controls external security services, like the so-called Cuban 5 at the U.S. jail for spying, and the CDR presidents report about every citizen on their block with whom they are meeting, their activities, and even what they are discussing. And they have to do that at least once a year. In Cuba, people accused of an offense by the police are guilty by law until proven innocent. So there are many thousands of dissidents in jail.
I was letting that sink in there. That's Cuba, Lifting the Veil by Carlyle MacDuff, our guest on the program tonight. The book, by the way, is available at Amazon. You can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. I'd be interested to get your input on the role of the U.S. in Cuba, historically, currently, and specifically the visit President Obama in 2016 to Cuba.
Well, the U.S. has an unfortunate history in Cuba, commencing with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Then, following the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898 in Havana Harbor, the U.S. joined the Cubans, who'd already been fighting for 3 years against the Spanish in what's perhaps mistermed as the Spanish-American War. But when discussions were held, the Treaty of Paris, between Spain and the U.S., Cuba wasn't even represented. Then the U.S. imposed a constitution written in English, not Spanish, with retention of Guantanamo as a naval base, the occupation of which is understandably a running sore. Next, the U.S. added the detested Platt Amendment, enabling the U.S. to intervene militarily in Cuba if it so chose. Then the U.S. Treaty of Relations in 1903 led to the self-appointment of William Taft as, quote, governor of Cuba from 1906 to 1909 and again into 1912. U.S. companies purchased huge tracts of land, controlling the sugar and fruit industries. President Eisenhower imposed the first embargo in 1958 on Batista, which aided Fidel Castro. The second and still current embargo of 1960 was applied by Kennedy, which had good objectives, but after 60 years clearly failed to achieve them. Then in 1998, the Helms-Burton Amendment, which offended many of the U.S. allies, by banning directors from entering the U.S. and probably led to the annual UN vote of 189 to 2 against the U.S. So that didn't endear the U.S. to the people of Cuba. Barack Obama's visit on March the 16th, March of 2016, it was from the 19th of March to the 22nd, was the first by a U.S. president since Calvin Coolidge in 1928, and it raised false hopes amongst Cubans of change, and his overtures about potential removal of the embargo were dismissed a mere 7 days later by the Castros, who, following those overtures, slammed the door shut in his face. But in his speech at the Alicia Alonso Theater in Havana, he urged Cuba, in the long years to come, do not despair, do not yield. So Cubans now recall Barack Obama, who with his wife and children went walkabout in old Havana, with an affection not shared with the current President Trump, who's tightened the screws even further by enacting Part 3 of the Helms-Burton, seriously affecting the people of Cuba without any obvious effect upon the regime itself. So it's a very mixed background.
Let's talk about Cuba today. A new president and a new constitution. What does that mean? Does it mean anything positive?
Well, nothing's changing within Cuba except a further decline in the food supply. Tens of thousands of acres of good land are reverting to bush. Raul Castro decided over 60 years ago to appoint Diaz-Canel, over 6 years ago, not 64, as president of the Council of Ministers. As first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raul is still in charge, as I said before, Diaz-Canel is a puppet. The purpose of the new constitution, written by a committee, chaired by Raul Castro, which meant it was written by Raul, was to change the word communist and communism to socialist and socialism, with even the word democracy inserted in an endeavor to persuade the outside world that change was taking place in Cuba. While any such claim is totally bogus, for the people of Cuba, it will not make any difference. The sole political party permitted is the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Cuba.
A couple minutes left in the program. With all of your knowledge and insight, which is in the book, Cuba Lifting the Veil by Carlyle MacDuff, talk about what you think the forecast is for Cuba. What do you think will happen in the coming years?
Well, I recall my late father saying to me in 1952, with regard to USSR, and over a dozen countries imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain, that the USSR will rot from within. And he was correct, for eventually it did rot from within, and 13 countries gained their liberty. But nobody's going to invade Cuba, and indeed the US agreed not to do so as a condition of Khrushchev withdrawing the nuclear weapons, along with similar action in Turkey. So now we have to wait for Cuba to rot from within. Following the death of Raul, problems may be accelerated by strife amongst two groups. One of the problems of communism, Rick, is that only one person can be dictator. On one hand are Raul Castro's family members, Alexander, who I mentioned, and his son-in-law, who controls Gesa. And on the other, a group of three politicos, Diaz-Canel, Bruno Rodriguez, and Marino Murillo. So there could be an internal struggle for power. The economy is a major problem because the USSR was the Castro regime's sugar daddy, and the implosion in 1989-90 created big problems, leading to the introduction of tourism to gain money. And then in 1998, Chavez of Venezuela began giving them oil as an economic support. Under Maduro, the Venezuelan economy has collapsed, but China and Russia are now giving very favorable terms of credit. But as Winston Churchill said, the inherent vice of socialism is the equal sharing of misery. But, so I think it's got to rot from within, Rick.
Wait, yes, go ahead, finish your thought.
Well, if I may finish my thoughts by reading just the final paragraph of Cuba Lifting the Veil.
Yes, please do.
I should also explain that I have a Cuban goddaughter aged 8 and daily ponder about her future. The final paragraph reads, "For the people of Cuba, there remains only that faint hope which they've tenaciously clung on to for so many long years. Hope for the younger generations, that they may yet know freedom and opportunity to live in their beautiful country, free of repression, with freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and freedom to vote for political parties of choice. Cubans deserve no less, for only then will they become members of an open society in a free world that waits to welcome them with open arms. liberty and that poignant cry for freedom beckon, and humanity demands.
It's been a fascinating conversation from the book, about the book, Cuba Lifting the Veil by Carlyle MacDuff. It's a fascinating and important read. Carlyle, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. I know you do these interviews and write the book at great peril to yourself and your family. Thank you for being with us on the program. The book, once again, is Cuba Lifting the Veil. You'll find information on Amazon, of course, and you can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Carlyle, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being with us on the program.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, Rick, and I just send good wishes from Canada to our excellent neighbors, the citizens of the United States.
Well, and accepted. Thank you so much for that. Cuba Lifting the Veil is the name of the book. Carlyle MacDuff is the author. Books available at Amazon. Information available by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. And we're back on today's program after these messages.